For 10,000 years, the rhythm of human life was dictated by the sun and the seasons. Tools were nothing more than extensions of the human arm, and power was limited to the strength of a horse, the flow of a river, or the direction of the wind. A merchant living in 1700 experienced a world that felt almost identical to the one his counterpart knew back in ancient Rome. Everything was handmade, local, and strictly finite. But in the late 18th century, in the damp, mineral-rich landscape of Great Britain, that ancient rhythm suddenly shattered. Humans figured out how to pull power straight from the earth itself and scale it beyond anything ever seen before. We call it the Industrial Revolution. Hey everyone, welcome to Tartaria Veil, where we peel back the forgotten layers of history to show how the past still whispers through our modern world. If this kind of deep dive storytelling grabs you right away, do me a quick favor and smash that like button. And if you want more mind-blowing journeys like this every single week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You're about to discover how one tiny island changed the destiny of every human alive today. Beginning around 1760 and quickly spreading to continental Europe and the United States, this revolution marked the dramatic shift from hand production to machines. It was the moment humanity unlocked the stored energy of millions of years of ancient sunlight trapped in coal and used it to drive the gears of an entirely new civilization. So why Britain? Why did this fire start there and nowhere else? In the mid-18th century, Great Britain stood as the leading commercial nation on Earth. It controlled a global empire stretching from the Caribbean to the Indian subcontinent. It was a nation of merchants, bold entrepreneurs, and brilliant thinkers. But more importantly, it was a nation literally sitting on a mountain of coal. That single resource, combined with an unmatched entrepreneurial spirit, would ignite a blaze that consumed the old world and forged something brand new. To understand how it all began, picture the 5 key pillars that gave Britain its unbeatable edge. First came high agricultural productivity. The British agricultural revolution had already kicked off with mechanical seed drills and iron plows, producing far more food with far fewer workers. This freed up a massive labor force now desperate for new jobs. Second was political stability and the rule of law. Unlike many of its neighbors, Britain had a legal system that truly protected property rights and encouraged the creation of joint stock companies, letting investors pool their money without risking everything they owned. Third, geography handed Britain an incredible windfall. As an island nation with extensive coastlines and navigable rivers, moving goods became surprisingly easy and cheap. Fourth was the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which had already created a culture obsessed with experimentation and discovery. And finally, there was that perfect economic storm: high wages for workers but incredibly cheap coal. In Britain it cost a fortune to hire a man, but almost nothing to buy coal. That mismatch created an irresistible incentive to invent machines that could replace human muscle. Before the factories arrived, production happened through something called the putting out system. In small villages across Lancashire, entire families worked right inside their own homes. Women spun raw wool or cotton into yarn while men wove that yarn into cloth on hand looms. It was a slow, domestic rhythm. But demand for textiles was exploding. Britain had developed a serious taste for what they called white gold, cotton. At first, British weavers couldn't compete with the delicate hand-woven fabrics pouring in from India. Indian labor cost 5 times less and the quality was unmatched. The British government even passed the Calico Acts to protect local wool and linen from those Indian imports. But instead of killing the trade, those laws forced British entrepreneurs to get creative. They had to find a way to make cotton cloth faster and cheaper than anyone else on the planet. The first domino fell in 1733 when John Kay invented the flying shuttle. This simple device doubled a weaver's output almost overnight, but it immediately created a crisis. There simply wasn't enough yarn to keep all those faster looms busy. It took nearly 8 spinners to supply just one weaver. That bottleneck lasted for decades until James Hargreaves stepped up with the spinning jenny. This wooden machine let a single worker spin multiple threads at once. It was still small enough to fit inside a cottage, but it was the very first step toward the factory system. Then came Richard Arkwright, a man who knew how to nurture inventors and guard his patents with an iron fist. He developed the water frame, a machine far too big and powerful for any home. It needed the constant force of a rushing river to run. Arkwright built the world's first true cotton mill, proving once and for all that production was no longer a family affair. It had become an industrial process. Within a few years, Samuel Crompton combined the best ideas from both machines into the spinning mule, which could spin thread finer and stronger than anything ever made by human hands. The results were staggering. In 1750, Britain imported just 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton. By 1850 that number had exploded to £588 million. Manchester, once a quiet little town, earned the nickname Cottonopolis. It became a city of nearly 900 factories where the sky stayed permanently grey from coal smoke and the air hummed day and night with thousands of spinning spindles. As the price of cloth crashed, the human cost started climbing. Indian handwoven cloth stayed superior for decades, but British machines were so productive they eventually undersold every artisan in India, destroying an entire industry and leaving millions without work. While textile mills were busy clothing the world, another revolution was happening underground. Coal mines had to dig deeper and deeper to feed the growing demand for fuel, and they kept hitting the same enemy, water. Mines flooded constantly and traditional pumps simply couldn't keep up. That crisis gave birth to the steam engine. At the turn of the 18th century, Thomas Newcomen introduced the first successful piston steam engine. These were huge hulking beasts that sat at the mouth of mine shafts. They were wildly inefficient by today's standards, burning enormous amounts of coal. But since the coal was right there at the mine, nobody cared. They allowed miners to go deeper than ever before. The real turning point came when a brilliant Scotsman named James Watt looked at the Newcomen engine and realized it was wasting massive amounts of energy by cooling the cylinder with every single stroke. Working with his business partner Matthew Boulton, Watt perfected an engine with a separate condenser. That one change made his machines so efficient they used only a fraction of the coal older models needed. Once Watt's engine evolved into the rotative type, it could directly drive factory machinery. For the first time in history, mankind was no longer chained to wind, tide, or animal muscle. A factory could now be built anywhere, not just beside a river. Steam power spread like wildfire. It blew the bellows of blast furnaces, hammered iron, and drove the looms. The invisible army of mechanical workers grew by thousands of horsepower every year. Steam also transformed the iron industry. For centuries, iron had been smelted with charcoal, which limited production to the amount of wood available. But the Darby family had already shown that coke, a purified form of coal, could fuel much larger blast furnaces. Cast iron became cheap and plentiful, turning into the primary building material of the age. The famous Iron Bridge became the first structure of its kind and sent a clear message to the world. A new material had arrived. New processes like puddling and rolling let workers produce structural iron at a fraction of the old cost. It was back-breaking, dangerous labor. Most men didn't live past 40, but their sweat built the bridges, factories, and eventually the railways that would stitch the entire planet together. As factories multiplied, the British landscape changed forever. This was the age of explosive urbanization. In 1800, only about 3% of the human population lived in cities. By the end of the century, that number approached 50%. People poured in from the countryside, pushed off the land by enclosures and pulled by the promise of steady wages. Manchester became the blueprint for this new world. Its population rocketed from 10,000 in 1717 to over 2 million by the early 20th century. But the growth was chaotic and unplanned. There simply wasn't enough housing. Families crammed into overcrowded slums with dirt floors and no sanitation. Rivers ran green with chemical waste and raw sewage. The stench of progress was everywhere. Clean water was a luxury. Diseases like cholera and typhoid raged through the streets. In some districts, more than half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Inside the factories, a completely new kind of discipline took over. In the rural world, work followed the sun and the seasons. In the factory, work followed the clock. Shifts stretched 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. Most early textile workers were unmarried women and children. Child labor wasn't new, but the factory system made it brutally visible. Kids as young as 8 crawled under moving machinery as scavengers, picking up loose cotton while the wheels spun inches from their fingers. They earned only a fraction of an adult wage, sometimes just 10%, and bosses preferred them because they were small, quick, and easier to control. This created a national scandal that finally forced change. The Factory Acts slowly limited working hours and began moving children from the factory floor into schoolrooms. Yet even amid all the hardship, the Industrial Revolution created something else: a massive new middle class. For the first time, businessmen, clerks, foremen, and engineers could afford comfortable homes with carpets, mirrors, and the latest consumer goods. Sugar, tea, coffee, and beautiful Wedgwood china became everyday luxuries for this rising urban elite. But factories needed raw materials moved fast and cheap. The old muddy roads and slow barges couldn't keep up. So Britain launched a transport revolution. First came the canals. Projects like the Bridgewater Canal proved that moving coal by water slashed prices almost overnight. A single horse could pull a barge carrying 10 times more than any cart. Canal mania swept the country, linking every major manufacturing center. Then the railways took over. Cheap puddled iron rails, rolling mills, and high-pressure steam engines made it possible. Visionaries like Richard Trevithick and George Stephenson put steam engines on wheels and created speeds the world had never imagined. The opening of the Liverpool to Manchester line in 1830 felt like magic. Passengers traveled between cities in hours instead of days. The railway broke the isolation of rural life, spread ideas at the speed of steam, and created thousands of new jobs. On the oceans, steamships freed global trade from the whims of the wind. The world was literally shrinking. For decades, Britain tried to guard its industrial secrets. Laws banned skilled workers from leaving and machines from being exported. But the fire couldn't be contained. British engineers carried the knowledge abroad, and other nations were desperate to catch up. Belgium became the second country to industrialize thanks to its rich coal deposits. France moved more slowly but steadily. Germany used its new railways to unify its market and turned the Ruhr Valley into a steel and chemical powerhouse. Across the Atlantic, the United States took British designs and added its own genius: interchangeable parts. Suddenly machines could crank out identical components, making mass production possible on a scale never seen before. Even far to the east, Japan made a deliberate leap. After the Meiji Restoration, the government built railways, funded model factories, and sent thousands of students overseas to master Western technology. By the end of the century, Japan had transformed from a feudal society into a modern industrial power. Not everyone cheered the new age. Skilled weavers who had spent years mastering their craft suddenly couldn't compete with machines. Desperate workers formed the Luddite movement, smashing factory equipment in the dead of night. The government responded with troops and harsh laws. In the countryside, laborers destroyed threshing machines that had made their jobs disappear. These were the death cries of an old world. But out of that pain, something powerful was born: trade unions. Workers realized that while one man was powerless, 1,000 men together could stop production entirely. Despite early bans, unions eventually won the right to strike and forced real improvements in wages and safety. The revolution also sparked fierce debates among thinkers. Karl Marx walked the streets of Manchester and saw a system of pure exploitation that he believed would one day explode into total social change. Meanwhile, the Romantic poets and artists recoiled from what they called the dark satanic mills. They mourned the lost connection to nature and the simple rural life. Even the environment began to push back. The first modern environmental laws tried to control toxic smoke from chemical plants. Scientists finally linked dirty water to disease and built vast new sewage systems that saved millions of lives. By the middle of the 19th century, the first industrial revolution had matured, but a second wave was already rising. One powered by steel, chemicals, and electricity. The Bessemer process made steel cheap and strong enough for skyscrapers and giant corporations. Petroleum started replacing coal. The internal combustion engine gave birth to the automobile. Electricity turned night into day and made the city pulse 24 hours straight. Department stores appeared, offering ordinary people a dizzying array of goods. The telegraph connected the planet in seconds. Mass literacy exploded as cheap printed books reached every corner of society. Looking back, the Industrial Revolution was the single most important event in human history since the invention of agriculture. It delivered sustained economic growth and lifted the material living standards of the Western world higher than anyone could have dreamed. For the first time, both income and population grew without stopping. But it also demanded entirely new ways of organizing human society. It created enormous global inequality and shifted the center of power from east to west. The quiet green fields gave way to grid-patterned cities and iron arteries of rail. The legacy of that 18th century spark is literally baked into the DNA of our daily lives. We are the direct descendants of that first coal-fired flame. The Industrial Revolution didn't just build our cities, it redefined what it means to be human. We moved from a species that followed the slow rhythm of the seasons to one that expects the entire world to move at the speed of a machine. We inherited a world of breathtaking convenience and speed, but we also carry the weight of the environmental and social shadows that came with it. The revolution began as a solution to very real problems and ended up changing far more than anyone ever intended. Revolutions always arrive quietly, and by the time we notice them, we can't imagine life without them. That's the story we love telling here on Tartaria Veil. If this journey through the birth of the modern world lit a spark in you, drop a comment right now and tell me, which invention do you think changed everything the most? The steam engine, the railway, or something else? Share this video with one friend who loves history because stories like this deserve to reach more people. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Tim and I'll see you in the next era, right here on Tartaria Veil. Stay curious and keep watching the past so we can truly understand the present.